Outnumbered did a segment, which you're going to see, regarding voter fraud. And I think that it depends on your point of view as to how prevalent or relevant voter fraud is. They've done numerous studies that show voter fraud is like so ridiculously low that it shouldn't even be a consideration. But for some reason, Republicans and the people at Fox and Donald Trump believe that voter fraud is a death sentence for the political process, so that laws must be made in order to stop this scourge on humanity. Funny thing is, whenever they go to court regarding the laws that they create to stop voter fraud, they rarely can demonstrate even one case of actual voter fraud. Now, there are cases of voter fraud. Let's not be stupid about this. I believe over the past 10 years, out of a billion votes, I believe there were approximately 22 actual cases of voter fraud. But they make such a big deal about it because of their agenda in order to restrict the vote of people who actually have a right to vote. Now, I point the following things out to you. After voter fraud laws are enacted, I call them repression, but they call them voter fraud laws. They do not make it easy for certain groups of people in certain locations to obtain the necessary IDs in order to be able to vote. Case in point, the state of Alabama. Once Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was struck down, they decided, because of budgetary issues, that they were only going to keep motor vehicle offices in certain quote-unquote counties open 1 day per month. Now, as most of you should be aware, that's where you go to get a driver's license and, more importantly, a state-issued identification card. So instead of making the ability to obtain an ID more easily available, they damn near made it impossible. Now, in case you're wondering, all but one of the counties that had their offices basically shuttered for all but 1 day a month, they were all predominantly and overwhelmingly populated by black people. Well, the state of Alabama was sued and they lost. So instead of having those offices open only 1 day a month, now they have to open those offices, and this has been going on for a while, 1 day a week. You can imagine the lines, since they were open 1 day a week, but imagine what they would have been if they were only open 1 day a month. They would have never been able to handle all the people. And their excuse was that people can easily go to their regional offices located in major cities. Well, hell, people that don't have driver's licenses that are subject to having to obtain a ride from someone else, having to drive an hour or more then wait online, tie not only themselves up, but the people giving them a ride. Forget about public transportation. So you tell me, was that an effort to restrict the vote? We had a problem in the state of Texas over the voter ID laws that were, I'll say, struck down, but referred back down to the Court of Appeals in order to fix the problem. The state of Texas would not accept certain IDs. These are picture IDs. Some of the IDs that they wouldn't accept were state university generated photo IDs. But they will accept your concealed carry ID because it has a picture on it. This really impacts older people who obviously were not drivers, otherwise they would have a driver's license which has a picture on it. And older people don't have the access to birth certificates, which are a major requirement for obtaining a photo ID. Sometimes the facility that housed the birth certificate is no longer in existence, has had a fire and the records were lost. Sometimes people were not born in hospitals, they were born at home. And, you know, there's a myriad of reasons why an older person might not have the documentation necessary, a birth certificate, in other words, in order to obtain a photo ID. Let's not even talk about the cost. If a photo ID is required to vote, that photo ID, state-issued photo ID, should be issued for free. There should be no cost involved. Now, one state, which will be nameless at this point, advertised that even though they were changing their laws and requiring strict voter IDs, that they were going to issue them for free, but you had to go to certain locations to get them. Those locations were in extremely remote areas. So what does that tell you? I mean, this voter ID deal it's killing me. And the only reason that it's being pushed as hard as it is, where it is because the GOP knows that their days are numbered and they need to retain power as much as possible, and restricting minority votes helps them to do that. Now I'm going to play this segment from Fox News, Outnumbered. And the funny thing about it is they want to talk about voter IDs, but they gloss over the fact that North Carolina, and they did mention it, but they pretty much glossed over the fact that North Carolina had its restrictive voter ID laws struck down by the Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court would not overturn the decision by the lower court. Funny that they didn't mention or go into detail on how restrictive the laws were. Just that the laws were struck down. Here we go.
So as we move closer to Election Day, a major split along party lines when it comes to the issue of voter fraud. A recent Gallup poll asking voters if they're concerned about ineligible voters casting ballots. More than a third, 36%, see it as a major problem, while 32% see it as a minor problem, and 29% not a problem at all. But when you break it down by party, 52% of Republicans see voter fraud as a major problem, while only 26% of Democrats agree. In the meantime, 80% of voters overall say they think a picture ID should be required to vote, compared to 19% who oppose it. Along party lines, look at this though, 95% of Republicans support requiring an ID to vote, compared to 63% of Democrats. Let's start with that issue, because Julie, my kids have to have an ID in order to go take a test. I mean, I took my 5-year-old for a kindergarten test. I had to have a picture ID for him, which seems sort of ridiculous, but he couldn't take the test without it. Why would you not need an ID to vote?
I would be.
All right, now that's a bad example. I mean, I don't know what the private school that she has her kid going to, but kids don't, for the most part, I mean, little kids don't need photo IDs in order to do stuff. Give me a break. Now, if the school is offering those for free, and I have my grandkids, they don't need photo IDs, so she's full of crap. And kids don't need photo IDs to fly on airplanes, okay? But adults do. So that's a bad example.
All about having an ID to vote if we made it easier for people who don't have the means to have the backup to get that ID, get the means, right? So in order to get an ID to vote, you need a driver's license or a birth certificate, which a lot of people, especially older people living in poverty, don't have access to anymore. Some people don't have driver's licenses. They can't afford to go get a state-issued ID. If we somehow made voter IDs and the means to get them cost-effective for people, I'd have no problem with it. But you had the North Carolina voter ID laws essentially thrown out because they disenfranchise, especially the people that I'm talking about, people who were largely rural, poor, and minority for that reason, because they don't have access to some of these forms of ID that you would need to get to vote. And so that's the problem for me.
But you need that for almost everything.
But it's not a constitutional right.
Okay, so
to
you're
have a claim.
at the hospital and you need emergency care. You have to prove that you know your first name. Like, you need some sort of identification that prove that you actually are who you say you are.
Well, not if you're...
That's bullshit. If you need emergency care, you tell them who they are, and they cannot turn you away. Now, if you're talking about private hospitals, okay, who are more concerned about getting their money than anything else, yeah, that's the case. But most public hospitals, you give them your name and information, and they are not looking for a photo ID. Okay, if you tell them you don't have one, you just don't have one, and they go from there. So what this woman is saying is not correct.
dying, I assume, right? If you can't answer.
But you can mail in and get a social security
If you're walking
card.
into the ER, you need to show some sort of identification. So why is it offensive at the polling station but not at the hospital?
The only reason I'm
By the way, if you're carted into a polling station on a stretcher, I guess you don't have to show ID.
right,
then either.
but the only reason listen, I have no problem with it intellectually. My problem with it is practically that people who don't have the money to get some sort of ID to vote. That's my only
But
concern.
how much money? I mean, you can get a social security card. You just go online at the library.
No, sorry, no, you can't, okay? You can get a social security card that costs you nothing, okay, but only in certain states, okay? In the state of Texas and the state of California, you cannot go online and get a social security card. I can tell you that for a fact because I had to go get one. You have to actually go into a social security office in order to get one, or you have to send them a letter.
And mail it in. Go ahead.
And in New York City, Bill de Blasio, one of his first programs, so everybody in New York feels like they're part of the city, has a citywide ID program that's free and sign up for it. Look, the first part of your argument I actually think is very valid, and it's also a very fixable problem. There should be ID laws that somehow make it affordable, easier to access having an ID. The problem is when you go to the rhetoric around this from a lot of Democrats further on the left, they just think the idea, period, of having to show an ID is racist. They think...
No, that's not true. See, he's blowing smoke up their ass. He's saying that He's saying that the idea of just showing an ID card is racist. No, it's the targeting of people who are mostly older, okay, and minority that don't have the access to the information. It's the targeting that's racist. Okay, and it's also the targeting of the black community, i.e., early voting, reduction, killing early voting, killing same-day registration, reduction of polling places, the movement of polling places to remote areas, all of that is considered racist, okay? So he's trying to conflate an argument.
It's a poll tax. They think it's something that could potentially lead to intimidation of people from actually physically voting.
I don't agree with that at all.
And I don't either, but I'm saying that's one of the odd rationales, which is why it's crazy that we still are having this conversation. If something as important and fundamental as voting can't be protected by just showing at least it's you who's doing it.
But Tony, you hear Donald Trump talk about this a lot in his campaign speeches, that this election could be rigged against him. How does that argument play for him?
Well, it plays to, as we see in this polling, elements of the Republican Party who do fear that, 52% at least, that voting fraud and voter fraud is a major issue. So it does get the base fired up a little bit. And if you remember from 2008, the whole Acorn kind of fiasco, that occurred in about a dozen swing states. So when people make this blanket statement that voter ID doesn't really affect anything, it's actually not true, because there are a handful of states that are critical, particularly in presidential elections, where even a change of 10 to 20,000 votes can impact
but your own personal experience, though, really does impact this. I mean, for myself, I've gone to polling places in New York. I walk in, you know, they're looking for my name. Oh, I don't know, you're registered here. They've handed me a ballot. I've checked it, and they've chucked it in a bin, an open bin behind them. I'm certain that my vote didn't count that time. I was with my kids down in Florida. I was covering the election last time around, and at a polling place, I don't know if the man was taunting me, but, you know, they were bringing in from different districts, and he said, my district is voting Obama no matter what, and he winked at me, maybe because I was from Fox and he was trying to antagonize me, but these are the kinds of things that really make you feel like it's not very high-tech in different places, and it's not necessarily that guarded.
But it isn't very high-tech. It isn't just the way that you feel. It's truthful. I mean, those of us who've lived in smaller communities know that some of them are high-tech and some of them aren't, and what that looks like. And so now the question is it politically allied with one group or another? And that's an important question to ask. If we get anything right in this country, it ought to be about the democracy of our voting days. As much as we say that the percentage of the population don't vote, then why don't we encourage them by at least getting that right? So what does that look like? We might have to man some stations.
Harris and I monitor our online presence a lot on Facebook and Outnumbered over time, and where the chats exist, and there are constantly people writing in about their concern about voter fraud.
It's real.
I'm worried about Putin hacking into these voter systems. That's what I'm worried about.
And you think by having an identification...
No, different issue, but if we're talking about voter fraud, that's what I'm worried about as well.
I do think it's a bigger issue, though, about IDs. We have 11 million plus undocumented people in this country. I think identification is something that probably is important, not just for voting day.
All right.
All right, so anyway, that's their take on voting fraud, which, again, if it was as prevalent as they claim it is, there would be a lot more examples that could be pointed to when the various states are taken to court, and there would be a lot more prosecutions. So they're talking about a solution for a problem that doesn't exist. Should people have IDs? Yeah, I 100% agree that people, when possible, should have IDs. I believe that the state should offer an easy way to obtain a free ID, okay? That should be a requirement for every state, especially if that ID is required to vote. Just my opinion.